Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 411 of the Running Rogue podcast. This is your host, Chris McClung, coming to you live, actually, on YouTube, simultaneous to recording the podcast. I don't think anybody's watching there, but I am doing a little test to see about doing some live YouTubing in the future, particularly for our Friday Q&As. I'm here back to solo episodes. As we talked about, James's last episode was a couple of weeks ago, episode 410. So you can go back to listen to that if you want to hear us both together. But I'll be continuing on creating content on my own, at least for the time being, and perhaps having an occasional guest. Excited to be back with you after being on vacation for a couple of weeks. Today, we're going to be continuing our journey through the book, talking about chapter 25 today, where we talk about planning and problem solving. And I think this is perfectly timed because many of you are a couple of months out from your fall races coming up here, and now is the time to start thinking about some of these things. There are a host of things in marathoning and half marathoning that are completely out of our control, but the goal is to narrow that list as much as possible by controlling the things we can control, and that requires planning. So we're going to talk about planning, and then we're going to talk about problem solving when things go wrong. And these are things that you want to start thinking through 2 months to a month out from race day so that you have all of your I's dotted and T's crossed. Before we get there, I wanted to quickly chat about Boston. The Boston Marathon changes relative to the new entry lottery, and I wanted to give you guys my perspective on that. For those runners who might not have been paying attention, Boston recently announced that in addition to their buffer process, which will happen as normal this year, they've added 1,000 spots that they're going to give away to qualifiers who did not meet the buffer, but who qualified and registered to join the race next April. So they're going to now take those that didn't make it via the buffer, which historically has been 3,000 to 5,000 or so qualifiers, and then draw from that group and pick 1,000 of them to make it into the race. Now, these are 1,000 entries that are apparently, quote, new entries. They're not taking away from the entries that are slotted to charity runners or to runners that are getting in via the buffer process or any other process. So these are new entries that they're now allocating in this way. And I've had a lot of people ask me my perspective on it. I can tell you that I'm excited for it. I'm thankful that they're creating another avenue for qualified runners to get into the race and to hopefully access the race, even if they don't quite have that buffer. And so for me, it's a good change. I definitely have some input. If anybody from BAA was listening or watching on the process, in particular, I would love to see them announce this group at the same time that they announce the buffer, so that there's just one opportunity for everybody to find out who's in the race versus announce the buffer, create disappointment for those that didn't get in via the buffer, and then later, 1 or 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, announce that 1,000-person group. I suspect they'll go that route, but I would prefer if they're willing to just announce it all at once, so you then don't have 2 disappointment points for those that didn't get in via the buffer. So I like it. Now, there are some people that have been critical of the decision that have said, well, why wouldn't they just let the next 1,000 in based on the buffer process? And isn't that only fair that the next people in the descending order list make it into the race? And you can make that argument, you can make that debate, and I understand why people might feel that way. But for me, I like this new approach because it opens up access to those who might not be close to the buffer, but who worked equally hard to get this goal. There's a lot of people out there, and I coach some of them, who aren't necessarily as naturally talented, and therefore they have to work really, really hard to hit some of these standards and milestones. And so that person who made a Boston qualifier by 1 second might in some ways work harder than the person that was able to get a 10-minute buffer qualifier because of the talent involved. And that's not to minimize the work done by anybody who reaches a qualifier, but based on the scale of talent there, some people are going to have to work harder than others to just simply get that standard. And that person who gets it by a second, who might have worked for years to do so, for them to now have an opportunity to get into the race through another pathway while they're still qualifiers, to me is hopefully part of what makes Boston great, because it just creates this opportunity for everybody to come together who's worked hard to achieve a standard, whether that be the qualifier or the charity runner. So I like it. It opens it up for those that don't get in through the standard descending order list. And we're really only talking about, probably for this year, a 5-minute range of qualifiers, those that are about 5 minutes under their qualifying standard to the qualifying standard. That's probably the range we're talking about. Online prognosticators are saying that the buffer is going to be probably between 5 minutes and 5:30 based on the number of qualifiers they're seeing in races. So we're talking about a 5-minute range. And so in this case, with this lottery, there might be those that have a 2-minute buffer that get in before those that have a 3 or 4-minute buffer. And that is okay by me, because again, it opens up this avenue for those that worked really hard, but might have only made it by a handful of seconds or 30 seconds or a minute. And some would say that that takes away from the rigor of getting into Boston. And I would say, no, it doesn't. They're still qualified. They're still achieving that standard. And this is just another pathway to honor the fact that they achieved that standard. And I think getting away from the descending order list for this small segment of new entries is okay by me. So that's my perspective on it. And I would think that most people in that range might feel the same way. It seems that the elitist among us tend to be the ones that get the standard with a buffer that's more than ample. And so anyway, I'm okay with it. I like it. My only advice for Boston is to make sure that they, if they can, announce it all at one time. So you're not creating two different disappointment points for those that don't get that buffer. So there you go. That's my 2 cents on it. Let's dive into my topic for today. We're going to talk about planning and problem solving for your upcoming race, whether that be a half or a full. I'm going to talk about kind of 2 categories of planning to be thinking about, and then I'm going to be talking about 2 categories of problem solving to be thinking about as you progress from race day to beyond. First, I want to give a quick overarching statement about this idea of planning and problem solving. And this is going to be partially inspired by what I saw from Josh Kerr, who recently set the world record for the mile by a second. He picked a date on the calendar in July where he was going to have the opportunity to break the record in front of his crowd, in front of the UK crowd in the London Diamond League. So he circled that date on the calendar, said he was going for the record, put it out there, and then organized his entire training block for the last probably 10 months to that point. All of his decisions, all of his planning has been with that one race in mind. And you can imagine, as a pro athlete going for a world record that has stood for, I think, 27 years, that the amount of planning and detail orientation that went into his pursuit of that goal on a specific date in July must have been immense with him and his coach and his team and all of those around him. So every single detail they were thinking about. They're thinking about their pacers. They're thinking about his uniform, gear, shoes. They're thinking about the splits that he should be running. They're thinking about the dynamic on the track with the other athletes that are going to be there. They're thinking about nutrition at the nth degree. I'm sure by that point in those final months, he was measuring every single thing that went into his body to make sure that everything went towards performance. He dotted every I, crossed every T. And yes, he's a pro athlete with a big goal who put that goal on the line. And so you would imagine that with those stakes, that anyone it's their job to do these sorts of things is going to do that. And then we might think, for those of us that are, quote, the everyday runner or the average runner, going out there to try to set a PR or to hit a certain standard or just complete a marathon or a half marathon, we might think, well, it makes sense that I wouldn't put that same level of rigor and planning into my preparation. And there might be boundaries and barriers to allowing you to do that with the fact that we're not running as a full-time job. We're doing it as a hobby on the side of trying to perhaps work with families and relationships and jobs and careers and other goals. But at the same time, if you listen to a podcast like this, you put a lot of weight on your ability to try to reach out and get your goals. And so why wouldn't you try to control the details to the nth degree, to the extent that you can? Control the controllables, because when you control the controllables, you limit the variability that can happen. And so, yeah, absolutely. You should plan to the nth degree in order to try to get a goal that you might have been working 5 or 6 months towards in the short term, and perhaps years towards if you look over your career as a runner. So planning is the most important first step. You have to make sure your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed. And then, as we know, as the great Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. There will be punches that you have to take along the journey. There will be things that you don't anticipate, because that's the nature of road racing in particular, and certainly the nature of long distance road racing like half marathons and marathons. So yeah, you're going to get punched in the mouth, and then you have to be able to adapt from the plan, problem solve, and then iterate to a new plan that's going to get you the best opportunity to get your goal. So we're going to talk about both things: planning, making sure you lock that down to the nth degree, and then we're going to talk about problem solving. How do you think through and scenario plan around the things that could go wrong, even though you don't know what is going to go wrong? So here we go. We're going to talk about, again, two categories on the planning side, and then two categories on the problem solving side. On the planning side, first, logistics. So we often think about the race itself as the main event, and it is, but you have to get to the race. So how are you going to get to the race in a way that means you've planned every detail? And so there's, a few categories of things that we talk about in the book. On the logistical side, there's travel, there's pre-race meals and fueling, and then there's transportation. And of course, there's probably other details as well, but those are the big ones. How are you going to plan your travel? That may have already been booked already if you have a race that's just a couple months out. But how do you take that travel planning and go to the next step? How do you plan your pre-race meals, and how do you plan your transportation so that you can get around race weekend in a way that is smooth and comfortable and efficient? So those are the things to think through. And I think now, when you have that, or if you have those nerves and anxieties that pop up in your pre-race prep as you start to think about race day, then this is a great opportunity to acknowledge those anxieties, those fears, set them aside, and then focus that energy on this type of planning. So when it comes to it, when we look at the category of travel, what are the details there that you need to think about? Obviously, this is going to depend a little bit on if you're traveling to your race or if you're doing a local race. But either way, there's some movement involved to get to that start line. So what does that look like? And if you're traveling out of town, do you have your flights booked, and you have reasonable flights booked, meaning you're not having to wake up at ungodly hours or perhaps land at insane hours, to the extent that you can avoid those things with your schedule so that you can optimize sleep around those things. So if you've got your flight booked, is your hotel locked in, and is it in proximity to the start line in a way that makes it efficient to get there? And I get that, your budget might depend on how close you can get or what you can spend. But I've found in a lot of years of traveling to races that typically there's something available for every budget if you're willing to be creative about it. So lock in hotel, lock in flights, and think about the details about that as it relates to making it smooth, making it efficient, making it easy and seamless for you, and obviously making it proximate so that you can get to that start line efficiently. And then related to travel, think about how you get into the airport, how you get from the airport once you get there to your hotel. all of those details we can think through and plan. And it might be as simple as just noting in your head, all right, I'm going to take an Uber. But what if it's a train opportunity, or there's a bunch of different ways to get from place to place? So just think through those details. It doesn't have to be a cumbersome process, but think through it, lock it in, have the plan. And then as we go to pre-race meals, when are you arriving? How many meals do you need to eat? How can you ensure that those meals are easy to get to, and then something that's going to be comfortable for your stomach so that you don't have stomach issues as you pop into the race itself? So, and by the way, for some people that might go as far as bringing your own things so that you can cook on your own in your hotel room. You know, there's people that bring hot plates and toasters and stuff like that and coffee makers along with them to their hotels. That's not something I personally do, but if you have a sensitive stomach, or if you have eating requirements that are a little bit more particular, then maybe that's something you want to do to minimize the potential variability of eating out, or perhaps make it work within your budget. So lock in those pre-race meals, both in your travel leading up, and then also, of course, and most importantly, the night before and the morning of, so you've got exactly what you need to do. You know, one of those little things for me, as just a simple kind of funny example, is I have a strange superstition of sorts where for a pre-race breakfast, I like to eat Lucky Charms, the cereal, the kids' cereal. I don't eat Lucky Charms any other time in my life, but on race day, I get a box of Lucky Charms and I eat it in that period before the race within a couple of hours. So I'm typically going to make sure I know how to get to a grocery store or a pharmacy like a CVS or a Walgreens where I can buy Lucky Charms. And if I feel like that's not convenient, then sometimes, I think only one time, have I had to travel with my own Lucky Charms. But that's something I do and think about and make sure that I have planned around. And again, might be a small thing relative to how I perform on race day, but it's what I'm used to. It has that placebo effect of making me feel like I'm ready to roll, and it just works. So I think through the details of how to get my Lucky Charms before I show up in a city. So nail down your pre-race meals, and then nail down your transportation. How are you getting from the airport to the hotel? How are you getting from the hotel to pack and pickup? How are you getting from the hotel to the start line? How are you getting from the finish line to your hotel again, so that you can start a reasonable recovery process? So think through all of those stages in the process and just lock it in. I actually got a text this week from an athlete who's doing Chicago, and she was planning her transportation from the hotel to the start line in Grant Park, and had a simple question about that, given her proximity to that start line. And so we had a quick chat about it. She made a decision about how to get there, to use public transportation rather than walk or jog, given that the distance she had to travel. And now she's got that locked in. Chicago's not for 2 months, but it can't hurt to plan those details so that something chaotic doesn't happen on race day, which throws you off. So those are the highlights on the logistical side. Then from an execution and a race strategy standpoint, there's 3 categories I like to look at as well: pace, nutrition, hydration, and then mental prep. So as we've talked about on this podcast many, many times, you want to create your pace strategy. We've got separate podcasts, and we'll talk later as we go through the book on pacing strategy and how to develop one. But you want to make sure that you have a plan, mile by mile, and how that plan adapts to the course and the terrain, depending on what that looks like. And then as you get closer, you can fine tune it depending on what the weather looks like. All of those details we have in the podcast archives, as well as we'll be talking about more as we go through the book. So we're not going to talk about how to create a race plan, but you just want to make sure that you have it and that you think about it mile by mile and section by section, so that you've got it locked in, and then you have a way to actually remember it, or at least prompt yourself on what that execution looks like. Personally, that's something I commit to memory. Some people like to write it on their arm. Some people carry a little note card in their pocket that they might have in a bag that they're carrying with gels and other things like that. There's a lot of different ways to prompt yourself on what the plan is, but have one, have a plan, and then have a way to remember it. That's the first thing. Second thing here, obviously, is nutrition and hydration. And this is something where I think having the plan and sticking to it no matter what might be the most important part of executing your race, especially for a long race like the marathon. And for this one in particular, but I think you should really think about it for all of these, is I like to write it down, put it on paper. What mile or what time, depending on which is better for you as a cue, are you going to be taking each of your nutritional elements, whether that be gels or something else? How are you getting your water and your electrolytes? And how does that dovetail with the water stops that they have out there on the course? And then how are you taking in anything else you might be taking in? Some people are doing ketones these days. Again, electrolytes, as I mentioned, to make sure that you've got the ability to absorb the fluid you're taking in. Lock those things in, write the plan out, whether that be mile by mile, K by K, or minute by minute, depending on how you like to track your nutritional intake. So lock that in. I also like to make sure that I'm dovetailing that with the course map so that I know exactly where the on-course aid stations are and how those might play into the plan. Obviously, water stops as a big part of that, but potentially gel stops as well, as many marathons are having these days. That could be a component of your planning. So dovetail both what has worked for you in training to the course setup, and then just write it out. And then when you get to race day, you're going to just execute that plan almost no matter what. So that's the second thing. Third thing is the mental side. We want to make sure that we are dialed in on our mental planning as well. And there's a couple of categories of things I think about here on the mental side. One, I always remind people to reconnect with and hopefully write down and visualize or put in a place you can see it, your purpose for the day. Why do you want the goal that you want on that day? So you can reconnect with why you signed up for this race in the first place. Then translate that into mantras, two types as we've talked about before, rhythm mantras and fight mantras, so that you can, on the rhythm side, make sure that you dial into a smooth and comfortable rhythm. And then on the fight side, when it gets hard, when you're having challenges, you can fight through those painful moments to finish strong. Lock in your mantras. Then after that, I like to write down and plan the other mental tools I'm going to use. For me, counting is a big one, especially as I get into the final miles of a race. So I might think about when I might put that tool to use. I also like to think about the other mental tricks I like to use. Another one is landmarks, particularly in the final mile of a race, is I'll go and look at the course map and sometimes map that to Google Map View, Street View, so that you can actually run virtually, or at least move through virtually over the course of the final mile and identify landmarks that might be a useful tool to push you to the finish line. In Houston, there's about a 1 mile stretch from when you enter downtown to the finish line on the other side where the convention center is. And I remember the last 2 times I did Houston, I went and counted the intersections as you pass through downtown, so I could use each intersection as a mental cue to push a little bit more. So write all that stuff down, commit it to memory, prepare and plan for it. So pace, nutrition, hydration, and mental. So those are the big executional elements. You could also add gear to that equation. What are you going to wear? What shoes are you going to wear? What other accessories are you going to need depending on the conditions? What are you going to need to wear at the start line if it's going to be cool that you can strip away? What are you going to need to wear during the race itself? How does that all play out as you step towards your race? So lock in the plans. There's other things to consider as we think about both of these categories, logistics and execution, but those are certainly the highlights. And you just want to make sure you have it dialed in, locked in, so that you can take the spectrum of outcomes and narrow them by controlling the controllables. But then, as we know, chaos can happen and probably will happen. And certainly there are smoother races than others, but there's going to be some sort of curveball thrown your way. And so then after you've done all that planning and minimized the potential chaos that can happen, then you've got to think about, okay, well, what if chaos happens? What can I do in order to prepare for the curveballs that might get thrown your way? And so for this, what we like to suggest is some what we call rainy day or just what if scenario planning around race day. And you're not going to be able to think through every possible wrong thing. And in fact, I don't want you to think through every possible wrong thing that can happen, because that can spiral. That can shift easily from a productive exercise to one that's not productive. So don't go crazy with this part of the process. But I do want you to come up with 3 to 4 scenarios in different categories across the planning spectrum that could go wrong. And then I want you to, in your visualization leading up to the race, whether that be while you're running or perhaps just daydreaming, waiting for something to happen in your life, then just visualize what you're going to do to deal with that challenge. So come up with 3 or 4 scenarios, not more than that, and problem solve them mentally in your head. And as we've talked about visualization before, visualization allows us to stimulate the nervous system in a way that is almost like you're actually doing the thing. And this is similar. It allows you to stimulate your problem-solving synapses so that if something wrong happens, you have a blueprint, so to speak, on what problem-solving looks like. And maybe, just maybe, the scenario you thought about will actually show up on race day. But if it doesn't, and there's something slightly different, you'll have thought through it and you'll be ready to address it as it comes. Because some of the best races I see, some of the most beautiful races, some of the most inspiring races are ones where something happens that throws somebody off, but then they just manage it and deal with it and then still make the most of the situation. So 3 to 4 things, problem solve those scenarios. So what are some examples? Some examples, and again, these can cover the spectrum, but I'll give you some basic ones. First one is, what if I go out too fast in mile 1? What if I get caught up in the chaos of the start line? What if I get sucked out too fast and end up hitting the mile 1 marker in a time that is 20 seconds or 30 seconds faster than I want to be? What do I do then? And that's going to happen. You're going to execute poorly on some mile, and then you got to be able to deal with it. And if it's mile 1, think through that. In this case, what I recommend if you go too fast on mile 1 is you just run the next mile on plan. So you use that as a cue, as a calibration point for your pace, and then you just try to run the next mile on whatever the plan was. So if you were trying to run marathon pace plus 30 seconds in mile 1, but ran marathon pace plus 10 seconds or marathon pace, then run mile 2 in marathon pace plus 20 and then progress down again. So back off a little bit. Doesn't mean you have to do anything drastic. I always say with pacing that every shift should be very, very subtle. It's a very subtle shift in effort that might slow you down a little bit, recalibrate, try to hit mile 2 on plan, and then get back on plan. And that's one side note about pacing, is that no matter what happens in any given mile, fast or slow, don't try to make it up. Just try to run the next mile on plan. Stay present with your pacing. So that's a potential scenario that you might run into. And it could be that you pick the first mile. It could be that you pick in a half the 10th mile or the 8th mile, or it could be in a full, you pick the 16th mile going too fast. And so you could scenario plan around a few different things there, but think through it in your mind's eye about how you would deal with it. The next one I think about as we're going through examples here is bad weather. What if the weather is not ideal? What if it's hot? What if it's raining? What if it's windy? How can I think through each of those scenarios and be specific with them when you're problem solving it and you're thinking about it as an example? Think about a specific temperature. What if it's 65 degrees and 80% humidity at the start line? How does that cause me to change my plan from a pacing perspective and then adjust my nutrition and hydration strategy as well? So think through all aspects, not just one. What if it's windy? And then pick a wind, 15 miles an hour, from what direction? And then go to the course map and look at where that would affect you most and how that might affect your pace strategy in that given section. So that, again, you can make those adjustments as you need to leading into race day on that weekend. And then as you're going through it, as you're experiencing it, so you can also be mentally prepared for facing those challenges at whatever point it may affect you. So, bad weather. Another example here. What if you're running the race with somebody, you've been training with somebody, and you're going to do this together, and then something happens? You lose each other at the start line. Maybe their race is going poorly, and they say, hey, you got to go after mile 10. You're on your own. I'm not feeling well today. Or maybe that happens at mile 21. Or maybe you get to 21 and they're feeling better than you are and they run faster in that next mile, and suddenly, while your pace hasn't changed, you're dropping back. What are you going to do then? How are you going to feel? How are you going to respond? Because it might not mean that your race is going poorly. It might mean your race is going well, but theirs is just going better. So think through a scenario around that if that's something you're relying on so that you're ready for it. I can tell you, I wish I had this advice leading up to my first marathon, Chicago, 2001. I'd trained with a friend of mine for it. We were going to do it together. The plan was to pace together. We were in similar shape, knew we could do it together. I'd run a lot of our runs together. And we get to the start line. He needs to go to the bathroom. I need to drop some stuff at gear check. We decide to divide and conquer. He said, all right, you take our stuff to gear check. I'm going to go to the bathroom. We'll meet back at this tree. Now, if you've ever been to Grant Park, you know there's a lot of trees in Grant Park. And the thing that ultimately happened to us was we both ended up at a different tree. And this was before the detailed corralling that happens now. And it was just one mass of people lined up with pace signs that ran along the side of the road. And I heard the gun go off. I'm sitting at this tree waiting for him, hoping he's coming, thinking maybe he just got stuck in the bathroom line. He never shows up. He's somewhere else waiting for me. We're both in different spots. The gun goes off for both of us. I wait. Finally decide to go. He waits. He decides to go. We ended up getting into the corral at different points. He ended up a little ahead of me, actually. And then I ended up a little behind him. We never saw each other. And so our plan to pace together and to run a certain way was suddenly out the window. And I had to adapt in real time, find my own rhythm, and finish. Ultimately, I think we finished only a couple of minutes apart. He was a little bit ahead of me that day, but we both had really solid negative splits. But I wish I was prepared for a scenario like that. And certainly I wish we had done some scenario planning around that potential thing so that we had a better plan for meeting up so that we could race together. But that's just another example. Another potential example here. What if you drop a gel, or what if a gel explodes on you and suddenly you went from the 5 you had in your pockets or in your waist pack to 4? What are you going to do then? What if that happens as you're trying to open it, you drop it and you're not able to go back and grab it, or it explodes on you and goes everywhere? What are you going to do? Are you going to take the next gel that you'd planned and then recalibrate the others? Or are you going to skip it? In this case, I wouldn't recommend skipping gels. I'd recommend taking that next gel and then spacing the others maybe slightly differently so that you still have the opportunity to take them at a reasonable spacing before that sugar crash. But that's a scenario to think through. And it might also mean that you decide to carry an extra gel to deal with that exact scenario if it happens. So you've got an extra just in case, which is, by the way, something I typically recommend people do if they have some reasonable space to carry their gels. So that's another example. But you can think of, an infinite number of potential things that could happen. Others would be, what if I feel a certain way at a certain point in the race that I didn't expect? What if I don't feel great getting to marathon pace at mile 4 or 5, which has happened to me in a race, where I just then relaxed into the pace until suddenly, finally, after 8 miles, I found that rhythm instead of after 4 or 5. What if you feel bad at mile 18? What should you do? What if you feel great at mile 18? What should you do? Should you pick it up there, or should you wait to the point of 20 or 21 where you had planned to start your close? So these are all things you can start to think through so that, again, those problems may not happen exactly as scripted, but at least it'll exercise that problem solving mentality so that you can quickly adapt to almost any scenario. And as you start to accumulate races you're preparing for, you'll start to accumulate more scenarios that you played out in your mind. So it may not happen this time, but it might happen the next time. And you can think back to this planning. So think about those what ifs, think about the rainy day scenarios, be ready for anything, because anything can happen, as we know in these races. So that's sort of race day problem solving. And then there's long-term problem solving. And you may get your goal on race day. You may not get your goal on race day. Doesn't really matter if you think about the long-term trajectory of what you're trying to accomplish, because ultimately at some point down the road, you're going to be smashing whatever you're trying to go for this time if you're consistent about it. And so then the question becomes, okay, what are my obstacles for long-term problem solving? And how can I take the lessons from this race, good or bad, and figure out how to find that next trajectory? And so we talk about, in the book, we talk about removing those bigger obstacles for training and perhaps for life so that you can unlock the next big potential thing, or so that if you missed a goal this time, then you can unlock it next time. And that's where we want you to think through, what are the obstacles to improvement in your world? And for this exercise, I like to tell people to think about 3 things. What are 3 things that I could do in my training or in how my training interacts with my life that are obstacles for me to getting better? We give some examples in the book. Could be routine and schedule and consistency. That was a big challenge for me at a certain point in my trajectory as a runner, when I had a bunch of kids and was trying to run a business, trying to coach athletes as well. And so that was a challenge for me. And then it was about unlocking and solving that part of it. For you, for somebody, it might be about training rigor and being able to do the rigor they need and stay healthy doing it. So how can you problem solve the obstacle of injury or frequent injuries, or maybe you have a history of a certain thing that's bothering you? How can you work through that obstacle? Could be how life interacts with your training, in that maybe fueling is a challenge for you and getting enough fuel is a challenge for you, or perhaps too much fuel is a challenge for you. How can you work on that obstacle? And so think about the 2 or 3 things that are obstacles for you. It could be the fact that you don't strength train consistently, that you aren't doing a traditional medium long run because you don't have time for it. What are those obstacles? Think about 3 of them. And then what I want you to do for that next training cycle is only tackle one of them. One of them, not all 3, just one at a time. I think singular focus relative to removing your obstacles is more impactful, more effective, because it allows you to incorporate change in your routine, your life and training and running routine that's manageable, that's relatively small. Because when it comes to adjusting habits, small shifts done consistently are better than big shifts done inconsistently. And so often I see people try to tackle all 3 things on their list, or maybe they have a list that's longer. And then they're overwhelmed by that pursuit. They're not effective, and they fall off quickly on a bunch of them, and then nothing's effective. So if you take one thing at a time and try to nail it, then that's what I recommend. So if it's add a strength training program to your routine, just tackle that. Don't make any other tweaks to your training. Keep the volume the same. Keep the workouts the same. Make sure, of course, that you have the right base period to incorporate that strength in a way that's sustainable, but tackle that one thing. Don't try to add distance to your long runs or rigor to your quality workouts at the same time, or to change your diet as well. Just be very, very specific on that one thing. Lock it in. Fix that part of training. Incorporate that sustainably. And then next cycle, you can tackle the next obstacle. And so do that iteratively after each of your races. And then you're going to be able to, over the long haul, be more effective at the changes you make, gradually remove those obstacles, reevaluate, and effectively tackle the new ones as they come, and therefore get where you want to go faster, because the tortoise generally beats the hare in the long term. So think about the bigger obstacles, and that's problem solving around your ongoing training and your ongoing life training balance so that you can smash those goals as they come. So there you go. You've got races coming up here in the next 2 to 3 months. Many of you, some of you, perhaps as fast as a few weeks, with Sydney just around the corner. Do your planning and then do your what if scenario planning so that you can deal with anything that might get thrown at you on race day and be as ready as you can be to deal with both the stuff you can control and the stuff that is out of your control. So with that, we'll wrap this first episode solo in a minute. Appreciate you staying with me, sticking with me. This will be available on YouTube as well as, of course, your podcast channels. If you need to find anything about us, you can check us out at roguerunning.com. Join me on the Friday Q&A, 2 p.m. Central, at Rogue Running on Instagram. And, of course, if you have questions about any of our training, you can email us, coaching@roguerunning.com, for our virtual group training, virtual one-on-one training, or our in-person training in Austin or Dallas. And with that, we'll wrap this one. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon.